let me tell you something about Veyrath Station before I tell you about Dr. Mara Solis. You have to understand the place first. The station sits at the edge of Corridor 9, what the older species call the breathing gap between the inner systems and the deep dark beyond the spiral's reach. It's not a glamorous posting. Nobody fights to get assigned to Veyrath. The gravity plating on level 4 has been misaligned for about 60 years and nobody's bothered to fix it. The water recyclers make a sound that some species describe as mournful and others describe as like a large animal slowly eating something. The cafeteria serves 700 recognized species from 22 star systems, which sounds impressive until you realize that means the food is almost never right for anyone and always slightly wrong for everyone. It's a working station. Scientists, diplomats, freight operators, customs agents, medical staff. The kind of people who ended up at Veyrath either chose the posting deliberately because they wanted to be left alone, or they got assigned there because someone in their chain of command didn't particularly like them. In both cases, they tended to be the kind of people who didn't like to be surprised. That was Veyrath Station. And Dr. Mara Solis walked into that environment on a cold cycle morning in the 4th month of cycle 4412, carrying 2 duffel bags, a cracked tablet, and a small plant in a biodome container that she'd apparently transported across 6 star systems by refusing to let it go into cargo. I was there. I need to say that up front because some of the testimonies you'll read in this file were collected after the fact, and there's already a mythology forming around Dr. Solis that's going to keep expanding until it stops resembling anything that actually happened. So let me be clear. I was in receiving Bay 7 when she arrived. I was the station's human liaison officer, a position that had existed for about 4 years at that point, and which, prior to Dr. Solis, had mostly involved helping the 3 other humans stationed here find food they could eat and translating their expressions for colleagues who couldn't read them. Her name appeared on my incoming personnel log 3 weeks before she arrived. Dr. Mara Solis, age 34, planet of origin, Earth, South American continental zone, field, xenotoxicology and comparative biochemistry, assignment duration, 18 months, purpose, collaborative research with Yelthari xenobiological team on cross-species chemical compound interactions. Xenotoxicology, the study of toxins produced by or affecting alien life forms. I remember reading that and thinking, well, that's going to be an interesting 18 months. I didn't know, I genuinely didn't know. She came through the arrival gate with her 2 bags and her plant, and the first thing she did, before she checked in, before she looked for me, before she did anything a normal arriving researcher would do, was stop dead in the middle of the receiving bay and look up. Veyrath's receiving bay has a ceiling that opens onto a transparasteel dome. You can see the stars from there. It's actually one of the more beautiful spots on the station, though most people who have been here more than a month don't bother to look at it anymore. But she stopped, and she looked, and she stood very still for about 30 seconds while the foot traffic of incoming and outgoing station personnel moved around her like a river splitting around a stone. I walked over to her. I said in English, "Dr. Solis, I'm Hara Yim, human liaison." She looked at me. Dark eyes, brown skin, dark hair pulled back in a way that suggested she'd done it quickly and not given it a second thought. She had the look of someone who spent most of their working time thinking about something other than their own appearance, not out of negligence, but out of genuine preoccupation with more interesting subjects. She said, "Those lights near the 4th arm, is that the Yelthari freight route, or is that something stationary?" I looked up. I said it was a stationary beacon, marking the edge of the Corridor 9 safe passage zone. She nodded slowly, still looking at it. She said, "It pulses on a 9-second interval." I said yes. That was standard for navigation beacons in the neutral zone. She said, "Interesting. Yelthari biometric research suggests their species' natural heartbeat under calm conditions is approximately 9 cycles per unit of time in their measurement system. I wonder if whoever designed the beacon was Yelthari or just an admirer. I didn't have an answer for that. Nobody had ever asked it before. She finally looked back at me, seemed to remember that she just arrived after a six-system journey, and smiled. It was a genuine smile, but quick. The smile of someone who's pleased by something, and then immediately moves on to the next thing. "Sorry," she said, "I do that. My ex-husband called it getting caught by the world. Where do I check in?" The Yelthari xenobiological team had been on Veyrath for about 2 years before Dr. Solis arrived. They were, by general station consensus, the most technically accomplished and socially exhausting research team on board. There were 6 of them. Their lead researcher was a Yelthari named Joreth Ulan, whom I am going to describe as fairly as I possibly can. He was brilliant. He was arrogant in the particular way that very brilliant creatures become when they've spent most of their career being correct. And he had a sense of humor that his own species found sophisticated, and most other species found either baffling or mildly alarming. The Yelthari are a species of roughly humanoid build with gray-green skin, 4-fingered hands, and a secondary sensory organ above their primary eyes that they use to detect electromagnetic signatures in the air. They breathe a slightly different atmospheric mix than humans can comfortably tolerate, which meant that Joreth and his team spent most of their work time in their sealed lab, and the collaboration with the human researcher was always going to involve some degree of navigating that barrier. The Yelthari had, over the course of 2 years on Veyrath, developed a set of opinions about human beings. Some of these opinions were accurate. Some of them were the kind of thing that seems accurate when you've only observed a small sample size in a controlled environment and convinced yourself that you've understood something universal. Their opinion about human beings and chemical toxins was this: humans are fragile. This was not an unreasonable starting point. By galactic standards, the human biochemical threshold for toxic compounds is notably low. The Yelthari themselves can tolerate a range of compounds that would require a human to receive immediate medical intervention. The Kesari, another species aboard the station, process most known neurotoxins as ambient background noise. The Drull have a digestive system that effectively uses what most species consider poison as a nutrient. Compared to most species in the galactic cooperative, humans are, biochemically speaking, somewhat delicate. Joreth knew this. He had built this knowledge into a kind of running intellectual condescension that he applied to the concept of humans in general. He didn't mean it cruelly. That's important to say. He genuinely found human biochemical limitations interesting, in the way that a researcher finds any notable characteristic of a study subject interesting. But interesting and respectful are different things, and somewhere in the 2 years before Mara arrived, Joreth had allowed interesting to slide quietly into comic. The prank was his idea. I have to tell you about the Duskbloom concentrate before I tell you what happened when they introduced it to Dr. Solis. Duskbloom is a plant native to the Yelthari home world's northern continent. It blooms in the brief, dim period between their planet's first and second sunset, hence the name. It's beautiful, apparently, if you're Yelthari and you're standing in the right latitude at the right time of year. The Yelthari have artistic traditions that span thousands of years celebrating it. It is also spectacularly toxic to approximately 64% of cataloged carbon-based species in the cooperative. Not all of them, and not uniformly. For the Kesari, it has a mild intoxicating effect similar to what humans experience with low-grade alcohol. For the Drull, it does nothing. For 3 species I won't name because they're not relevant to this incident, it's actually used as a medicinal compound in controlled doses. For humans, the Duskbloom concentrate, which is the highly refined, stable form of the compound, not the raw plant material, causes a cascade reaction in the peripheral nervous system that produces, in sequence, intense burning sensation in any mucous membrane it contacts, temporary visual disruption, severe nausea, and if the exposure is significant enough, cardiac arrhythmia. There is a treatment. The medical bay has it. The reaction time before serious symptoms is approximately 8 to 12 minutes, depending on the form and quantity of exposure. The quantity in the vial that Joreth produced was small, a few milliliters. Enough, by his calculation, to make a human experience about 30 seconds of intense discomfort before the concentration dissipated and nothing permanent occurred. Not enough to require medical intervention. Just enough to make a human recoil dramatically. It was meant to be a demonstration, a moment of theater to welcome the new human researcher with a reminder, gentle, Joreth thought, of the biochemical landscape she was entering. You're fragile out here, dear human. Be appropriately humble. That was the intended message. The message that was actually received is the subject of the rest of this document. Part 2. The morning of the incident. Dr. Solis spent her first week on Veyrath doing what any reasonable new researcher would do. Orientation, safety briefings, equipment calibration, getting lost on level 6 because the corridor numbering convention on Veyrath was designed by a species that experiences space nonlinearly. And everyone agrees it makes no sense, but nobody can agree on a replacement system. I walked her through most of it. She was pleasant company, the kind of person who asks questions constantly but listens to the answers just as carefully, which is rarer than it should be. She cataloged everything. She carried a battered physical notebook in addition to her tablet, and I saw her writing in it constantly. Not transcribing information exactly, more like annotating the world as she moved through it. Little observations, questions, things she wanted to come back to. On her third day, we passed Joreth's lab corridor, and she stopped at the sealed door and looked through the observation window. The Yelthari team was inside, working. She watched them for a minute. She said, the secondary sensory organs. Do they use those for reading chemical signatures in the air? I said yes. She said, so they've already smelled me. I said probably yes, through the ventilation cross-feed. She said, what do I smell like to them, do you think? I said I didn't know. She said, I'm going to guess, interesting, weird, a little concerning. She said it without any anxiety. With genuine curiosity, like she was pleased by the idea of being something worth noticing. She knocked on the observation window. Inside, Joreth looked up. He looked at her. He said something to the researcher beside him that I later learned translated roughly as, "Ah, the fragile one arrives." Dr. Solis couldn't hear him through the sealed environment, obviously, but she smiled anyway and gave a small wave. Joreth nodded once, which is the Yelthari equivalent of acknowledging someone you haven't decided what to think about yet. The decision about what to think about Dr. Mara Solis, that came a few days later. The incident happened on a Tuesday. I'm using the Earth calendar designation because it's what I use, and because it matters in a small, human way that it was a Tuesday. Tuesdays on Veyrath Station have a specific feeling that anyone who's worked here long enough will recognize. The week's preliminary reports are due. The Level 3 commissary runs out of the good protein packs. The atmospheric recyclers do a maintenance cycle that makes the air taste slightly metallic for about 2 hours in the morning. Tuesdays feel like the universe is gently testing your patience. Mara had been on the station for 8 days. She was scheduled to begin her first formal collaborative session with the Yelthari team that morning. Her first time actually entering their lab environment, which required a brief atmospheric adjustment process and a safety protocol that she'd already reviewed 3 times and had, by all accounts, memorized completely. I walked her to the lab at 800 hours. The Yelthari team was assembled, All 6 of them, which in retrospect should have been a flag. The session was meant to be an introductory meeting, a handshake and tour of the lab's capabilities. You don't need all 6 researchers for that. But at the time I thought they were just being thorough, or perhaps they were curious about the human. Both seemed reasonable. The atmospheric adjustment chamber, a small room where the air composition is gradually shifted to something that works for both human and Yelthari respiratory systems, took about 4 minutes. I went through it with her. I'd done it before with the other human staff on occasional visits. It gives most humans a slightly lightheaded feeling, like the first few seconds of altitude adjustment. Mara noticed it, blinked once, and wrote something in her notebook. She wrote something in her notebook during the atmospheric adjustment. I should have known then that the next 18 months were going to be unlike anything I'd prepared for. Inside the lab, Joreth introduced himself and his team with the formal Yelthari greeting, a precise bow of the head and an extension of the right hand held flat, palm up, which loosely translates to, "I offer you my honest attention." Mara watched him do it and then performed it back precisely without having been taught. She'd researched it. Of course she had. Joreth was visibly surprised. He covered it quickly, but I caught it, the slight widening of the secondary sensory organs above his eyes, the brief recalibration of his expression. The tour went smoothly for the first 20 minutes. The Yelthari lab was genuinely impressive. A wide, carefully organized space with 3 separate compound analysis systems, an atmospheric simulation chamber for testing reactions in different environmental conditions, a wall of specimen storage running floor to ceiling, and a central workstation where their main research terminal held about 4 years' worth of accumulated data. Mara moved through it carefully, asking precise questions, not broad questions, specific ones. She'd done her reading. She knew what they were working on. She knew which compounds were in current active analysis. She asked Joreth about the 3rd specimen column, 3rd row, a particular Vereth native compound they were studying, and cited a paper he'd published 7 years ago that she felt contradicted the methodology they were currently using. There was a pause. Joreth said, in the careful way that experts speak when they've been caught somewhat off guard by an unexpected source of competence. "You've read the Comparative Biochemistry Compendium, Volume 8. She said, "I've read Volumes 6 through 14. Volume 9 is better, I think, but your work in 8 is foundational. I have questions about the ammonia analog variance table on page 441, if you have time later." Another pause. Then one of the other Yelthari researchers, a younger one named Faeleth, who I later learned was the most good-natured member of the team, made a sound that in Yelthari is somewhere between impressed and amused. It's a very specific exhalation through the secondary nasal passages, and it translates imperfectly but most closely to something like, "Well, then." Joreth glanced at Faeleth. A decision moved between them in that glance. I didn't read it correctly at the time. I thought it meant, "This human is more interesting than we anticipated." What it actually meant was, "Let's see how far the interesting goes." They brought out the vial 12 minutes into the tour. They kept it casual. That was the thing that, looking back, makes me feel the particular kind of complicated feeling that I still haven't entirely sorted out. They kept it casual, which meant it was well planned. Joreth moved to a side bench and picked up the vial in a way that was meant to look natural, incidental, like he just happened to be passing something he needed to show her anyway. The vial was small, clear glass, Yelthari manufactured, sealed with a pressure cap. Inside it, approximately 3 milliliters of duskbloom concentrate, a deep amber color, slightly luminescent in the lab lighting. He held it out to her. He said, in the standard cooperative language that the translation units rendered into English for her earpiece, "This is a compound we're working with this cycle. One of our more interesting specimens. Would you like to examine it?" Standard research etiquette. You hand a specimen to a colleague. You let them look at it, completely normal. What was not standard was the expression on Fayaleth's face on the left side of my peripheral vision. I caught it too late to do anything. A barely suppressed excitement, the kind of expression that, in any species, means this is the part where something funny is about to happen. But I was half a second too slow. Mara took the vial. She took it. She held it at eye level in front of the lab lighting. She turned it slowly, watching the way the amber liquid moved against the glass. Her expression was neutral, professionally attentive, the face of someone looking at something with genuine interest. Then she did something none of us expected. She opened it. Not quickly, carefully. She pressed the release on the pressure cap with practiced ease, the kind of familiarity with Yelthari lab equipment that suggested she'd either used it before or studied the design until it was second nature. The cap released with a soft hiss of equalized pressure. The smell hit the air immediately. Duskbloom concentrate has a distinctive odor even in small quantities. It's one of the things that makes it useful as a research subject. You can detect it without instruments because it saturates the air quickly and produces a very specific sensory signature. To Yelthari, apparently, it smells like the approach of rain on their home world, which is why it was historically associated with their art and philosophy. To humans, according to the file in the medical database that I later pulled, pungent, sweet acidic, organic compound reminiscent of tropical fruit fermentation mixed with a sharp chemical undertone. I smelled it and moved back instinctively. Not dramatically, I just stepped back, because I'd been briefed on the compound when I reviewed the lab's safety protocols, and I knew what it was. Mara smelled it and tilted her head slightly. She said, "Oh, interesting." Then she held the open vial closer to her face. I said very quickly, "Dr. Solis." She said without looking at me, "It's Duskbloom concentrate, Hara." "I know what it is." She tilted her head the other way, still examining it. "The scent profile is different in person than the documentation suggested. There's a secondary note underneath the primary compound, something I didn't see flagged in any of the papers." She glanced up at Joreth. "Is that a degradation product from the stabilization process, or is it endemic to the compound itself?" Complete silence in the lab. All 6 Yelthari researchers had gone very still in the particular way that prey animals go still, when something has not behaved according to the model they built for it. Joreth said very carefully, "You know what this compound is?" She said, "Duskbloom concentrate, Paleth family organic toxin, Yelthari northern continent origin. Effective against approximately 64% of cataloged carbon-based species. Produces peripheral nervous system cascade reactions in humans. This quantity," she held it up slightly, assessing, 3 milliliters give or take. Enough to be uncomfortable but not enough to be dangerous if not ingested or absorbed through mucous membrane. The vapor at room concentration from this vial, with my current exposure time, is below the documented threshold for systemic effect." Another silence. She looked at the assembled team. She looked at Joreth. She looked at the vial. She said, "How long did you think it would take me to start screaming?" Now, I want to be precise about what happened in the next few seconds, because it has been reported differently by different people, and the mythology has already started to fill in the gaps with things that didn't actually happen. Mara did not laugh at them. She didn't mock them. She didn't perform triumph or superiority. Her voice was even. Her expression was, if anything, genuinely curious rather than angry or amused. She was asking a real question. She actually wanted to know. Joreth, to his credit, answered it. He said, in a tone that was navigating several competing emotional responses simultaneously, "We estimated approximately 4 seconds of exposure before significant distress." She nodded. "That's not unreasonable based on the published human response data, Most of it's from the incident records, accidental exposures, that kind of thing. People who didn't know what they were dealing with. She looked at the vial again. The fear response alone would have produced about 30% of the reaction you expected. Cortisol spike, heightened sensory sensitivity, hyperventilation. The toxin does the rest. She resealed the vial, pressed the cap back into place with the same careful ease with which she'd opened it, set it gently on the bench beside Joreth's hand. She said, "I've been studying xenotoxins for 11 years. I have a particular interest in compounds that cross biochemical categories, things that affect species with different baseline biochemistry. Duskbloom is in my top 20 most studied compounds. I've handled the raw plant material. I've worked with concentrate up to 10 milliliters in a controlled environment." A pause. "I knew what this was when you picked it up. The color and luminescence are distinctive." Joreth said nothing. She said, "I took it anyway because I wanted to smell it. The secondary note I mentioned, I've never seen it documented. Do you know what it is?" This is the part of the story that I find most remarkable, and I've thought about it a great deal in the years since. What Mara Solis did in that moment was not brave in the dramatic sense. She was not standing in the path of a weapon. She was not throwing herself in front of danger. She knew precisely, in the way that only someone who has spent 11 years becoming expert in something can know, exactly what she was dealing with. She had calculated the risk and found it negligible. She had decided that the thing she didn't know yet, the secondary scent compound, was more interesting than the thing she already knew, that the toxin wasn't going to seriously harm her at that concentration and exposure time. She had taken the vial because she was curious. That's the thing that broke the Yelthari's model of human beings. Not fearlessness in the heroic sense, not aggression, not performance. Pure, uncomplicated, professional curiosity that had so thoroughly colonized her sense of self, that even when 6 alien researchers were watching her, with a compound designed to make her suffer, the most interesting thing in the room was the secondary scent note she didn't have a name for. Phaeleth was the first one to recover. He walked to a different bench and pulled up a compound analysis report on his tablet. He said, in Yelthari, and his translator rendered it. "The secondary compound. We identified it 3 weeks ago. We believe it's a byproduct of the stabilization medium reacting with the tertiary molecular chain. We haven't published because we haven't confirmed whether it changes the toxicological profile." Mara said, "Does it change the profile?" Phaeleth said, "We don't know yet. That's the current working question." Mara said, "Can I see your analysis data?" And that was it. That was how the collaboration actually began, not with the formal introductions, not with the tour of the equipment, but with Phaeleth pulling up his analysis data and Mara leaning over to look at it, and the two of them starting a conversation about a secondary compound in a toxin that had been brought out to frighten her. I stayed for about another hour. Then I excused myself because it became apparent that I was not contributing anything and my presence was, in some ways, the only awkward thing remaining in the room. When I left, Mara was at a workstation with Phaeleth on one side and another Yelthari researcher, Death Kavan, on the other side, and the three of them were arguing in the pleasant, animated way that researchers argue when they disagree about something exciting. Joreth was standing slightly apart, in the posture that I had learned meant he was recalibrating. I found out later what he said to her, because Phaeleth told me. After I left, Joreth approached the workstation. He waited until there was a natural pause in the conversation. Then he said to Mara, formally, "I designed the introduction of the compound as a demonstration of your biochemical vulnerability. I believed it would be instructive." Mara looked at him. She considered this for a moment. Then she said, "I know." He said, "I didn't expect your response." She said, "I know that too." A pause, then, the paper on page 441, the ammonia analog variance table. "What is your question?" And she told him. She had a precise, detailed 14-point question about the methodology, and she'd apparently been formulating it for weeks before she arrived, because she'd anticipated that this collaboration was going to hinge on whether Joreth's published methods were internally consistent. They talked for 4 more hours. Fayaleth described the rest of that first day to me as the most uncomfortable and productive day I have spent in 8 years of research. And I say uncomfortable because I spent the first hour waiting for Joreth to apologize, and then realizing the human had made it irrelevant. And productive because by the end of the day, we had 3 new hypotheses and a revised experimental framework. I need to tell you about a separate conversation I had with Mara that evening, because it's relevant to understanding what she was like, and it's not recorded anywhere else. I found her in the station's observation corridor, the long walkway on level 7 where one entire wall is transparisteel, looking out into the corridor 9 space. She was sitting on one of the benches with her notebook, writing. She had a cup of something that she'd apparently gotten from the Yelthari commissary. She'd asked them for something warm to drink, and they'd given her something from their own supply without thinking through whether it was compatible. And she drunk it anyway and reported that it tasted like very aggressive tea. I sat next to her. I said, "How was your first day?" She looked at the window. She said, "Good, really good. They're exceptional. Joreth is arrogant, but he's brilliant, and his arrogance is the kind that comes from competence rather than fear, which means it's workable. Fayaleth is going to be a close collaborator, I think. He has the kind of mind that finds the question underneath the question." I said the toxin thing. She said, "I should have said something about knowing what it was before he handed it to me. I didn't because I was curious what he'd do." A pause. "That was probably unkind of me." I said, "You weren't frightened." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the stars outside. She said, "I was frightened the first time I handled a xenotoxin. I was 23, and it was a sample of Kesari venom concentrate, which is much less dangerous than duskbloom but which I didn't understand yet, not really. And I was in a lab with a professor who I later realized had terrible safety protocols, and I was trying very hard to look like I knew what I was doing." A beat. I was terrified. My hands shook. I nearly dropped it. I said, "What happened?" She said, "I didn't drop it, and then I studied it, and then I understood it, and then I spent the next 11 years studying the next thing and the next thing until duskbloom is something I can pick up without my hands shaking because I know exactly what it can and cannot do to me at every concentration and exposure level and metabolic condition." She looked at her notebook. "Fear is useful. It's information. It's your body telling you that you don't know enough yet. The answer to that is to know more, not to stop picking things up." I sat with that for a while. She said, "They thought they were showing me where my limits were, and they did. They just showed me the wrong limits." The research collaboration that began on that Tuesday morning lasted the full 18 months of Mara's assignment, and then extended by a further 8 months when both parties filed for a voluntary extension. In that time, the team published 6 papers. 3 were standard xenotoxicological analyses. 2 were methodology papers that revised existing frameworks for cross-species biochemical response analysis. The 6th paper, which appeared in the Galactic Cooperative's primary scientific journal in the 14th month of her assignment, established a new subdiscipline that they proposed calling comparative biochemical threshold mapping, which is the systematic study of how different species' biochemical limits can be used to understand the underlying evolutionary history of compounds, rather than simply cataloging the danger they represent. It's a significant paper. I've read it. I won't pretend to understand all of it, but I understand enough to know that it reframes a set of questions that xenobiologists had been asking in the same way for about 300 years. The secondary compound in the duskbloom concentrate, the one Mara noticed in the first seconds of holding the open vial, was identified, documented, and named. By convention in Yelthari biochemical research, newly identified compounds are named by the researcher who first identifies them for documentation. Joreth offered this honor to Mara. She named it Phea compound, after Phaeleth, because she said he was the one who'd pulled up the data instead of standing in the corner being embarrassed. Phaeleth, upon hearing this, made the sound that in Yelthari is the equivalent of an involuntary laugh. He later said it was the first time in his research career that someone had named something after him, and that he had expected, if it ever happened, to feel important, and instead he felt something considerably warmer than important, which was its own kind of discovery. Joreth is the harder story to tell, not because it's complicated in a dramatic way. There was no confrontation, no breakdown, no dramatic reconciliation scene. It was quieter than that, and quieter things are sometimes harder to describe because they don't announce themselves. About 3 months into the collaboration, Mara presented a preliminary analysis of the duskbloom secondary compound that suggested it had a moderating effect on the primary toxicological cascade under specific temperature conditions. The implication was that the compound might, under the right circumstances, be developed into a treatment for duskbloom exposure in humans. Joreth's contribution to this analysis was substantial. He had the foundational knowledge of Yelthari biochemistry that Mara needed to model the mechanism correctly, and he provided it not because he was required to, but because by that point he'd become genuinely invested in the question. After the preliminary analysis, there was a team review session. At the end of it, Joreth said, in the careful way he said things when he was being precise about something that mattered, "When I introduced the compound in the first session, I considered it a demonstration of categorical difference, of human limitation." A pause. "I was wrong about what I was demonstrating." Mara said, "You were demonstrating your assumption, which is a legitimate research subject." He said, "I made an error." She said, "We're researchers. We make errors. The question is whether the data changes the model." He said, "It does." She said, "Then we're doing science correctly." That was it. No ceremony. No apology extracted, no forgiveness granted. Just the revision of a model, which is what scientists do when new information arrives. I've thought about that exchange more than almost any other in the time I spent watching this collaboration. It's such a human way to handle something. Not the grandeur of confrontation, not the spectacle of reconciliation, just the quiet, almost businesslike acknowledgement that the world had provided new data and the framework had been updated. News of the first-day incident traveled through Veyrath Station in the way that news travels through any small, closed community, quickly and with accumulating embellishment. By the end of the first week, there was a version circulating in the Level 5 commissary in which Mara had drunk the duskbloom concentrate. The version prevalent in the engineering section had her deliberately provoking the Yelthari team by opening 3 different toxic compounds in sequence and smelling them all. There was a version among the Kesari personnel that had her challenging Joreth to a formal biochemical tolerance contest, and winning by a measure that was physiologically impossible. I tried to correct these where I could. The actual incident was notable enough without the embellishment, but the embellishments persisted, and I think they persisted because they were answering a need, not for accurate information but for a story. Specifically, for a story about humans. Veyrath Station had species from 22 star systems. Most of them had opinions about humans. These opinions ranged from dismissive, the Kesari, who found human social complexity tedious and their biochemistry unimpressive, to fascinated, the Yelthari, whose opinion was shifting in real time, to something closer to respectful concern, the Droll and the Myveth and the older species who had seen more of the universe's history, and recognized what it meant that a species had gone from inventing agriculture to operating interstellar vessels in a period of time that most of them considered essentially instantaneous. What the story of Mara and the Duskbloom concentrate did was give all of those opinions a specific texture. It gave them something to argue about. The dismissive one said, "She simply knew what it was, that's not remarkable, knowledge isn't courage." The fascinated one said, "But look at what she did with the knowledge, she turned it into curiosity instead of fear, and that is remarkable." The concerned and respectful one said, "This is how they're all like that, they just don't all know it yet." I spoke with a Myvith researcher named Yesaranka about 3 months into Mara's assignment. The Myvith are among the older species. They've been operating at interstellar scale for approximately 8,000 years. They are very careful observers of younger species, because they have long enough memory to know what younger species eventually become. Yesaranka said to me, "You were there for the Duskbloom incident." I said yes. She said, "The Yelthari thought they were showing the human her limits. They were actually showing her the beginning of a new area of research." I said that was a reasonable way to describe it. She said, "We see this regularly with humans. When you show them a wall, they want to know what's on the other side. When you show them a danger, they want to understand the mechanism. When you give them a toxin, they smell it." A pause that in Myvith facial language indicated something like bemused wonder. Most species, when shown a limit, accept it. Humans catalog it, and then try to map it so precisely that the limit becomes a kind of knowledge they can carry with them instead of a boundary they have to stop at. I said I wasn't sure that was entirely accurate as a universal human trait. She said, "No, not universal, but it's the trait that produced Dr. Solis. And it appears with remarkable frequency for a species so young." The Kesari personnel were less philosophical about it. A Kesari named Vrethaman, who worked in the Freight Operations Division and had absolutely no stake in the incident whatsoever, offered his opinion to me in the commissary approximately 2 months after it happened. Kesari are large, blue-gray, four-armed beings with an extremely practical worldview that has very little patience for what they consider excessive emotion. He said, "The Yelthari tried a thing, the human knew about the thing. The human did the thing anyway because she wanted information. What is there to discuss?" I said, "People are discussing what it means about humans." He said, "It means the human was paying attention." Paying attention and not being frightened when you don't need to be frightened is the minimum competence for operating in the cooperative. He paused. The Yelthari are embarrassed because they assumed the human wasn't paying attention. The lesson here is about Yelthari assumptions, not human nature. He then went back to his meal. He had, by Kesari standards, provided a comprehensive analysis of the situation. I am including it in this archive because I think he was not entirely wrong. Part 7. Dr. Solis on her own species. There is a conversation I recorded with her explicit permission because I'd started keeping notes on the collaboration for station records, and she knew I was doing it. That happened approximately 7 months into her assignment. It was in the lab, late in the duty cycle, and most of the Yelthari team had already left. Only Phaeleth remained, working at a side bench, and Mara was compiling data at the main terminal. She had been talking about a paper she'd read, a survey of human responses to xenotoxicological exposure incidents. Most of them were accidental, a few were deliberate. She said, out of nowhere, "Do you know what I think is actually remarkable about humans?" I said I didn't. She said, "Not that we're brave, not the dramatic stuff, it's that we're so specific in what we care about." I said I wasn't sure I followed. She said, "Every species I've encountered in the cooperative is brave about the things their evolutionary history prepared them to be brave about. Kesari are fearless in physical confrontation because they evolved in an environment where physical confrontation was the primary selection pressure. Myveth are patient in the face of uncertainty because their environment rewarded long-cycle thinking over short-cycle reaction. The Yelthari are methodologically brave. They'll pursue a research question into territory most species won't touch, because their survival history rewarded curiosity about their chemical environment. She paused, organizing something in her data set. Humans are brave about things that shouldn't matter to us evolutionarily. We run into burning buildings to save people we've never met. We climb mountains for no material benefit. We spend years learning things that won't feed or protect us, just because we wanted to know. We develop relationships with species that don't share anything with us biochemically or cognitively, and we feel genuine attachment to them, and we grieve when they die. She turned slightly from the terminal to look at me. I picked up the duskbloom concentrate because I wanted to smell it. That's not brave. That's just knowing enough to be specific about what the fear should apply to. The fear should apply to things I genuinely don't understand. Once I understand them, the fear is misapplied. A pause. What I think is actually remarkable about humans is that we can redirect our fear. We can pick it up and move it to the right place instead of leaving it where evolution put it. She turned back to the terminal. Most species, from what I can see, can't do that as easily. Their fear is structural. Ours is more like a tool we can adjust. Phaeleth said, from across the room, without looking up from his bench. I have been listening to this conversation, and I want it noted that I find it both accurate and extremely unsettling. Mara said, "That's appropriate, write it down." He did. Mara's extended assignment ended in month 26. There was no ceremony. She wouldn't have wanted one, and the research team was not a ceremony kind of group. She packed her bags, put her biodome-contained plant, which had survived the full 26 months, which Phaeleth had noted was statistically unusual for Earth-origin flora in Veyrath's artificial light spectrum, under her arm, and made her rounds. She and Phaeleth shook hands. Then, unexpectedly, he offered her the Yelthari formal greeting, the precise bow, right hand extended flat, palm up. She performed it back, as precisely as she had on the first day. She and Death Coven argued briefly and affectionately about a data point in their 6th paper that they had agreed to disagree on for the entire 26 months. They didn't resolve it. They weren't going to. They seemed to find that comfortable. She and Joreth stood together at the lab's observation window for a few minutes. I wasn't close enough to hear what they said. When they separated, Joreth did something I had never seen him do before and have not seen since. He gave a small, formal nod to her, the deeper version. The one that in Yelthari carries the connotation of "you have changed my understanding of something." It's reserved for colleagues whose work has genuinely revised the way you see a problem. She received it the way she received most things, with a small nod back, and then a practical comment about needing to check the departure gate schedule. I walked her to receiving bay 7. The dome was open above us, the same view that had caught her attention 26 months earlier. She didn't look up this time. Then she stopped. She looked up. She said, "The beacon's still on the 9-second interval." I said yes. She looked at it for a moment. She said, "I asked Joreth once early on whether the interval was deliberate, whether a Yelthari had designed it." I said, "What did he say?" She said, "He said no. It's an automated frequency calibrated to the corridor 9 transit density, purely mathematical, nothing to do with Yelthari heartbeat." A pause. She smiled, the same quick, genuine smile from the first day. But he said it like he was slightly disappointed that it wasn't. She picked up her bags. She walked to the departure gate. She didn't look back because she was already thinking about whatever came next. Archivist's note, KLVTHTAN, Species Cataloging Bureau. I have compiled this record from the following primary sources. Direct testimony of Hara Yim, Human Liaison Officer, Veyrath Station, Cycle 4, 410-4, 415. Direct testimony of Fayaleth xenobiologist, Yelthari Collective, Veyrath Station assignment. Contemporaneous notes from Hara Yim Station liaison log. Indirect testimony of Joreth Ulan as reported by Fayaleth. Station commissary and corridor observation records. The published research record of the Veyrath Xenobiology Collaborative, Cycles 4, 412-4, 414, and one informal conversation record, collected with the subject's permission. I have chosen to present this record in narrative documentary form rather than standard catalog format because the incident at its center resists the kind of categorization that standard catalog format applies. It is not, strictly speaking, a xenobiological discovery event, though it produced significant xenobiological discoveries. It is not a diplomatic incident, though it altered the working relationship between species in meaningful ways. It is not a human achievement in the dramatic register that most such archived incidents occupy. It is, instead, a record of a human being operating precisely at the intersection of knowledge and curiosity that appears, across many years of human observation, to be the defining characteristic of the species when they are functioning at their best. The Yelthari gave Dr. Solis a toxin as a joke. She already knew what it was. She took it anyway. She smelled it. She found something new in it. This is, in the most compact possible summary, what humans do. What follows this note in the archive are the published papers, the full testimony transcriptions, and the formal species interaction log. For readers with access to the xenobiological database, the paper on comparative biochemical threshold mapping can be accessed at reference code GCU CBTM 4413. The Pheia compound entry is under reference code YBC secondary 44137. For readers who want only the essential finding of this case file, I offer the following, which is drawn from the final paragraph of Dr. Solis's research statement, submitted with the 6th paper. The most useful thing a researcher can do when confronted with something dangerous is not to retreat, but to understand the precise shape of the danger, its edges, its limits, its conditions. A limit that is fully understood is no longer simply a wall. It is a map, and a map can be used to find what is on the other side. Filed and sealed. Veyrath Station, Neutral Zone Corridor 9, 3rd Cooperative Era. 1. What I didn't put in the official record. The thing about the official archive is that it captures what happened. It does that accurately. But there's a version of events that exists in the record between events, in the texture of time that doesn't make it into testimony because nobody thinks to ask about it. What I didn't put in the official record was the Tuesday morning, about 3 weeks into the collaboration, when I walked past the Yelthari lab corridor and heard laughter coming through the atmospheric seal. Not polite managed social interaction, actual laughter. Mara's laughter, which is immediately identifiable because it has an involuntary quality to it. She laughs when she's genuinely caught off guard by something, and it's loud and brief, and she sounds almost surprised by it. And layered under it, the Yelthari equivalent, the sharp exhalation through secondary nasal passages, rapid, rhythmic, that in their species indicates genuine amusement. I stood outside the door for a few seconds. I thought, well, something is happening in there. What was happening, I found out later, was that Fayaleth had made an error in his data transcription that had accidentally produced a compound formula that, when analyzed, would theoretically be an extremely effective cooking ingredient. He'd caught the error and was mortified in the way that researchers are mortified when their mistakes are ridiculous rather than significant. Mara had pointed out that the fictional compound would theoretically taste, by her estimation of the molecular profile, something like burned caramel and betrayal. And Fayaleth had found this description so precise and so absurd simultaneously that he'd lost his professional composure entirely. It was, I later learned, The first time any member of the Yelthari team had genuinely laughed in the presence of a human being. Not performed social courtesy, not polite acknowledgement of humor, genuine, involuntary amusement. I didn't put that in the official record because I didn't know how to quantify it. But I've thought about it more than almost anything else from those 26 months, because what it represented was something that shouldn't have happened as quickly as it did, a genuine collapse of the professional distance that Joreth's team had maintained between themselves and the humans they'd observed at Veyrath. The distance that said, we study, we don't participate. Mara dissolved that distance in 3 weeks, not through any strategy, not through any deliberate effort at connection, just by being completely, entirely herself, curious and specific and occasionally very funny about burned caramel. I also didn't put in the official record the conversation I had with Mara in month 4, when the collaboration was running well, but she was having a hard time personally. She didn't broadcast it. That was characteristic. She was the kind of person who experienced difficulty quietly, not because she was suppressing it, but because she'd learned to hold it alongside everything else rather than in front of it. But I noticed, because part of my job was noticing when the humans under my liaison care were running into something that needed acknowledgement. It was a communication from Earth. Her daughter, she had a 10-year-old daughter, which I'd known from her personnel file but which she almost never mentioned except in the abstract, had broken her arm at school. Not seriously. The break was clean, the treatment was straightforward, everything was medically fine, but Mara hadn't been there. She was 6 star systems away studying the secondary notes in alien toxins, and her daughter had broken her arm, and Mara had found out about it 18 hours after it happened because of the communication lag. She told me about it in the observation corridor again. Late duty cycle, station quiet, the stars outside doing what stars do. She said she wasn't frightened. She told me she wasn't frightened. A pause. She's 10. She was definitely a little frightened, but she knows I'll worry about her being frightened, so she said she wasn't. I said, does that help? She said no, a pause, and yes, because it means she's paying attention to me too, even from 6 systems away. I said, do you want to talk about it? She looked at the stars for a while. She said, I want to tell you something that I think about a lot, about being here specifically. I said, okay. She said, when I was growing up, space travel was still, it existed, but the idea of being 6 systems away from home, collaborating with alien research teams was something that happened to a very specific kind of person. Special training, government selection, all of that. She looked at her hands. And now it's a posting, just a job, a good one, a rare one, but a job. And the thing that nobody really talks about is that it doesn't feel smaller for being a job. It still feels enormous. Every morning I walk to the lab past the dome corridor and I see those stars and I think, those are other suns. And I'm here and my daughter is somewhere under one of those specific other suns. And I know which one, and that's the thing that's both astonishing and also the thing that means I'm going to be okay. A pause. Knowing which sun. I didn't say anything for a moment. She said, I'm going to be fine, I am fine, she's fine. I just needed a minute to say that out loud where someone could hear it. I said, I'm glad you told me. She said, thank you for not immediately trying to fix it. That's the thing about the official record. It captures what can be documented. It doesn't capture the observation corridor at the late end of a duty cycle, or the specific kind of strength that it takes to pick up a toxin and smell it, and also be 6 systems away from a 10-year-old with a broken arm, and hold both of those things at once without either of them cracking the other. I should say that my relationship with Joreth was, throughout Mara's assignment, a complicated one. He was professional with me. He was always professionally appropriate. But I'd always sensed a particular quality in how he engaged with me personally, as the human who existed at the edge of his research environment, that was managing rather than fully open. That changed in month 19. He stopped me in a corridor. He said, directly and without preamble, which is how he always communicated when he wasn't being strategic. I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that it is a genuine question. I said, okay. He said, when Dr. Solis is confronted with a difficulty, a research dead end, a personal problem, a setback, what does she do? I thought about it. I said, she starts asking questions, a different angle, a different entry point. She looks for the part of the problem she doesn't know yet. He said, yes, I've observed this. A pause. Most species, when confronted with a genuinely difficult problem, one for which the known approaches have failed, experience what our psychology describes as forward cessation, a kind of functional freeze. The model space collapses, and the researcher must rebuild it before proceeding, and the rebuilding process is slow. I said, humans do that too, sometimes. He said, yes, but Dr. Solis, and I want to be precise, I'm not overgeneralizing to all humans, rebuilds the model by adding curiosity rather than resolving the existing model first. She doesn't rebuild and then question. She uses the questioning to rebuild. A pause. I cannot determine whether this is learnable or whether it is structural. I said, what's the difference, practically speaking? He said, if it's learnable, we can teach it to our researchers. If it's structural, if it's something about how human cognition is built, then it's something we need to understand if we want to collaborate with humans effectively. I said, my honest opinion. He said, please. I said, I think it's both. I think there's something structural about how humans handle uncertainty that tends in this direction. We're a young species. We evolved in an environment where not knowing was more common than knowing. So we developed an appetite for inquiry rather than a dependence on established knowledge. But Mara specifically, she spent 26 months developing that tendency into a practiced skill. You can learn in that direction if you work at it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that is a useful framework. Then I was wrong about what the Duskbloom demonstration would demonstrate. I said, I know, you told her that in the lab. He said, I'm telling you too, because you were there, because your record of the event should include this. I said, I appreciate that. He nodded, the deep, formal one. Then he went back to his lab. I stood in the corridor for a moment after he left. Joreth Ulan, brilliant and arrogant and genuinely transformed, telling a human liaison officer that he'd been wrong, not because he was required to, not because it was procedurally necessary, but because the record should be accurate. That's the thing about Mara Solis. She had a way of making the people around her want to be more precise. About the world and about themselves. I have to say something about the plant. It was a small thing, a Monstera deliciosa, if I'm remembering the Earth species name correctly, which I believe I am because she told me once, and the name is very specific. It was in a biodome container, which is a sealed transparent habitat that maintains specific atmospheric and humidity conditions. She'd carried it across 6 star systems, and for 26 months she kept it on a shelf beside her workstation. The Yelthari lab had very specific atmospheric conditions that were not ideal for Earth-origin plants. Mara knew this. She never brought the plant into the lab. It stayed in her quarters during lab hours and came with her to the observation corridor sometimes in the evenings, because the dome lighting more closely approximated the Earth spectrum light it needed. Phaeleth found out about the plan about 2 months in, when he came to her quarters to continue a work discussion and saw it. He spent about 3 minutes examining it through the dome container with the same precise attention he gave to specimen analysis. He asked 11 questions about it. He wanted to know the origin, the age, the exact atmospheric requirements, the soil composition, the watering frequency. He started monitoring its growth. He set up a data log. He didn't ask Mara about it and he didn't tell her. He just started tracking the plant's development as if it were a legitimate research subject. Because to Phaeleth, Anything that grew and changed over time was a legitimate research subject. Mara found out about the data log in month 16. She came to me about it, and she was not upset but not sure what she felt, and she wanted to talk it through. She said, "He's been tracking my plant for 14 months. I said, "Yes." She said, "Without telling me." I said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Is it a good data log?" I said I hadn't seen it, but based on what I knew of Phaeleth, it was almost certainly meticulous. She was quiet again. Then she said, "He's watched it grow every week." For 14 months. I said, "Yes." She said, "That's the most Phaeleth thing that has ever happened to anyone." She went back and asked him to show her the data log. He showed her. It was, as predicted, meticulous. Charts, measurement indices, growth projections, notes on response to the light spectrum from the dome corridor versus the artificial lab lighting. She told me later that she'd found 3 entries where he'd written something that didn't belong in a growth data log. In month 4, when the plant had developed a new leaf, he'd written, "New emergence. The human hasn't noticed yet." In month 9, during a period when the dome corridor lighting had been disrupted by maintenance, growth rate declining, adjusting lamp proximity per documented Earth spectrum requirements. He'd moved a lamp for the plant without saying anything. In month 14, significant new growth. Dr. Solis will be pleased. She showed me those 3 entries and she said, "He didn't have to do any of that." I said, "No." She said he did it because. She stopped. She seemed to be working out how to finish the sentence. She said, "He did it because it was there and it needed it and he noticed." I said, "Yes, I think that's exactly why." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "That's a very human reason." I said, "Or a Phaeleth reason." She said, "Maybe they're related." I only asked her once, directly and plainly, about the Duskbloom incident. Not the events of it, those I witnessed and knew well, but about the interior of it, what it felt like. It was about a month before her assignment ended. We were in the commissary, the Level 5 commissary, on a Thursday afternoon, which is one of the quieter moments on the station. The lunch rush is done. The pre-dinner prep hasn't started. The kind of in-between time when conversations that need the space to be honest can find it. I said, "Can I ask you something about the first day?" She said, "You mean the toxin?" I said, "Yes." She considered. She said, "Ask." I said, "When you took the vial, when you opened it, was any part of you, even a small part, not completely certain?" She looked at her drink for a moment. She didn't answer immediately. That was the tell. Mara, when she was completely certain about something, answered quickly. The pause meant she was being genuinely honest with the question, rather than reflexively reassuring. She said, "The vapor exposure window. I'd calculated it at below systemic threshold for my current body weight and metabolic rate, but I'd calculated it at the published threshold data, which is based on incident records. And incident records are imperfect. People in accidents aren't necessarily your exact biochemistry. The error margin is maybe 10%. I said, "So there was some uncertainty." She said, "There's always some uncertainty. The question is whether the uncertainty is the governing factor." A pause. 10% error margin on a concentration that's already below threshold. The worst case is I start to feel uncomfortable and I hand the vial back and we go to the medical bay and I'm fine in an hour. She looked at me. That's not nothing. It's uncomfortable, but it's not the thing that should make you not pick up the vial. I said, "And the thing that should make you pick it up?" She said without hesitation, "The secondary compound note, the thing I didn't have a name for, that was real, that was new, that mattered." She sipped her drink. She said, "The fear was proportionate. It just wasn't large enough to be governing." I said, "Do you think about what would have happened if the calculation was off, if it had been stronger than you estimated?" She said, "Yes, of course." A pause. And I think, then I would have handed it back and gone to the medical bay and come back the next day and asked about the secondary compound, because that would still be new. She looked at me with that quick, honest look she had. The secondary compound was going to be there whether or not the toxin got to me first. So the toxin had to not get to me first. That's the whole calculation. I sat with that. Then she said, "You're asking if I'm reckless." I said, "No, I'm asking if you're ever frightened." She said, "I am frequently frightened. I'm just precise about what I'm frightened of." She paused. "I'm frightened of publishing something wrong. I'm frightened of making an error in a framework that other researchers build on because then the error propagates. I'm frightened of my daughter growing up and me having missed parts of it I can't get back." A pause. "I'm not frightened of a 3 milliliter vial of a compound I've spent 4 years studying, at a concentration below the documented systemic threshold, held at arm's length with good ventilation." She set her cup down. "Fear is information. It's telling you what you don't know. When I know something well enough, the fear about that specific thing migrates to the edges, to the error margin, to the things that could still surprise me. I follow the fear. It points to what I need to understand next." I left Veyrath Station 14 months after Mara's assignment ended. Different posting. I won't go into the details, it's not relevant to this record. On my last day, I stopped in the Yelthari lab corridor. I looked through the observation window. The lab was running new research cycle, new specimens, the team's 4th paper with a new human collaborator who was apparently already asking questions about the ammonia analog variance table. Fayaleth was at his usual bench. He saw me at the window and gave me the formal Yelthari greeting, the bow, the right hand extended flat, palm up. I performed it back, precisely. Mara had taught me how. Sometime in month 6, in a corridor, while we were walking somewhere and she'd been practicing it. She practiced it sometimes, she said, to make sure she didn't get sloppy with it, because getting sloppy with a formal greeting felt like inattention, and inattention was the thing she was always working against. I had watched her and asked her to show me, and she had. And we'd both done it in the corridor with completely serious expressions, and then both started laughing because we were 2 humans in a space station, practicing an alien greeting in a corridor at 900 on a Wednesday, and what else could you do? I looked at Fayaleth through the window and performed the greeting. He performed it back. We held it for a moment. He was smiling, the Yelthari version, which involves the secondary sensory organs above the eyes relaxing into a slightly wider position, which reads to humans as somehow warm once you know what you're looking at. Then I walked to the departure gate. The dome was above me, stars, navigation beacon at the 4th arm pulsing on its 9-second interval. I counted. 9 seconds. I thought about the Yelthari heartbeat. I thought about whether the person who calibrated the beacon had been paying attention, or had simply arrived at that number through mathematics, and whether there was really a difference. I thought about Mara saying he was slightly disappointed that it wasn't. I thought about fear as information, and curiosity as the answer to fear, and the secondary compound in a toxin that nobody had named until someone picked up the vial and smelled it. I thought about a plant being watched for 14 months by a researcher who recorded the human hasn't noticed yet, and moved a lamp in the middle of the night without saying anything. I looked at the stars for a moment. 6 systems away, somewhere, Mara Solis was probably in a lab, probably holding something she wasn't supposed to pick up, probably smelling it, probably finding something new that nobody had thought to name yet. I picked up my bags. I walked through the departure gate.